What do you think when you think of Egypt? The pyramids, the Sphinx, mummies, the Nile River, pharaohs, King Tut, Cleopatra. Fun fact, Cleopatra wasn't actually Egyptian, she was originally from Macedonia. It seems the knowledge that we have for Egypt is pretty much stuck in the past, but what if I told you that things aren't exactly what they seem to be? Instead of every woman being treated like Cleopatra, they're all fighting for basic rights. So the question is, what are women's rights in Egypt? Before we dive into the topic of women's rights in Egypt and where they stand, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the country of Egypt. This is where Egypt is. The currency they use is called the Egyptian pound. It's actually pretty cool. They have their famous landmarks on it, like the Sphinx and the pyramids, and some of them have camels on them. Egypt is mostly desert, and the majority of its population is cradled around the Nile River. The biggest city being Cairo, the country's capital. Egypt's population is about 95.69 million, with about 19.5 million living in the city of Cairo. The Egyptian population has been on the extreme rise lately. At the turn of the century, they hit about 66 million people, and then till this year, they hit 95.69 million, and this is an extremely large jump. In 2011, a huge event that changed Egypt recently happened. The start of something called the Arab Spring exploded across the Middle East, including Egypt. Rebellions broke out, and the young people of the Middle East demanded better government and rights. Women's rights was one of them. President Hosni Mubarak was forced to step down after being in power for more than 30 years. But when the dust settled and the formal government came crashing down, the people of Egypt were left with no government and no clue where to go. With no structure, a group called the Muslim Brotherhood seemed like their best option, so they elected President Mohamed Morsi.
Islamist Mohamed Morsi has become Egypt's new president.
A member of the Brotherhood, who was later arrested and sentenced to 20 years of prison. With the Brotherhood in charge of things, it seemed that women's rights were going to be taking a step back instead of forward. One quote that the Brotherhood said is that they do think it's okay for women to protest, but they feel it would be more dignifying if women's brothers and husbands did it for them. What's happening to women in Egypt? Women in Egypt get sexually harassed all the time. About 8 out of every 10 get harassed every day. In a survey, 99.3% of women had had some form of sexual harassment happen to them. Because of this, the city of Cairo has put separate gender chains. In larger cities, they have malls that are labeled families only to prevent single men from coming in. As the right for women's rights grows stronger, so does the sexual assaults. One reason for this is because Egypt is rooted in a very classical view of women. This classical view being that the women do very domestic things and follow the rules of the men. As women are craving for more rights and better education, some people are still rooted in the old way of things. Others are using sexual assault to keep women away from fighting for their rights. When they do get attacked, they do blame it on the women.
Islamist media have been broadcasting Salafist preaching in which women are blamed, and other perverse justifications, critics say, since the rise of Islamist political dominance in Egypt after the 2011 Arab Spring. None of the rapists have been prosecuted so far. In February, a member of the Human Rights Committee in the Egyptian parliament said publicly that the women were 100% responsible for being assaulted. This kind of discourse from people in positions of supposed responsibility spreads the mentality. This young man, questioned about women and where the fault lies, says, "It's not a good habit, it's wrong, but they lead us to do this. From the way they dress, from the way they walk, everything. They push Egyptian men to do this."
Another thing that's happening to women in Egypt is genital mutilation. It is speculated that about 95% of women between the ages of 15 and 45 have been genitally mutilated. There's been a ban on genital mutilation, but this ban hasn't seemed to stop anyone from doing it. Some believe that genital mutilation is based in religious motives, but nowhere does it say that you have to do so in Muslim and Islam laws. Feminists in Egypt have been working for years to get women's rights. In the Arab Spring, they thought it would bring a sense of hope, but they were met with more hate. This is Nawal al-Sada. She is an Egyptian writer, and she's been fighting for women's rights in Egypt for the majority of her life. She believes that with women's rights, there needs to be education on equality so that children can grow up and understand equality.
How can you have democracy in the parliament and no democracy at home? If you don't have democracy starting from birth, that children are educated, equality, and justice and freedom and dignity from childhood. You cannot have democracy under the parliament, because democracy is a way of life. It's a way of life, it's not a decision.
Ways to fix things. One huge way for things to change in Egypt is for the government to recognize what's happening to their women.
There have been so many cases of mobbing, of sexual assault, and then recently also gang rape cases. And the response to that, of course, has been, a zero response from the government.
The Egyptian government ignores what's happening to their women and chooses not to do anything about the sexual assaults and attacks. They choose to blame all of these things on the women instead of the rapists and the groups that are making these things happen. Another way to stop this is to have better awareness and spread better education about equality. When the kids are educated about women's rights and the younger they are, they won't have to grow up in the social norm of treating women badly. They can change it. Using education can also help women get into better places of power to make changes. If women were given better education opportunities, then they will be able to get into higher places of power. In conclusion, Egypt is pretty far from being a safe place for women, from the assaults to the attacks and the lack of education. But following the lead of feminists like Nawala Assad and standing with women's rights protests, Egypt can start to take the steps in the right direction. With the right steps forward and the help from others, maybe someday Egypt can be a good place for women.